And I'm not dismissing patriarchy. I'm not dismissing structural racism. But if you really want to understand how some men relate to women in terms of their attitudes and behaviors, you have to go back to their earliest childhood experiences with their mothers. And when we look at the data, particularly in Black communities on child abuse, the data tells us that the majority of the abuse and the fatalities are perpetuated by women.
All right, here he is.
So why do Black people think spanking is the thing to do?
Because there's a lot of myths around it. We think it's a uniquely Black thing, that it's intrinsic to our culture, that it's something that we bought over here from Africa. Like, there are people who will argue that they took everything from us, our names, our cultural practices, our natural ways of doing things, but whipping children is the one thing that survived the Middle Passage. And so they think that corporal punishment is something that has existed since the beginning of time, and that's not true. It is a byproduct of colonization and enslavement. So colonization isn't just about land. It's about changing the way you think, the way you eat, the way you worship, how you are in natural kinship with your own children. And so the enslavement process distorted how we think about children. We think about them as property. We think that this is a religious mandate. And when you look at pre-colonial West African traditions, there's no evidence that we engaged in this kind of ritualistic violence against our kids. So the enslavement process, living through the terror of Jim Crow, state-sanctioned violence. We got the comedy. We've got ministers who preach about it.
Wait. So we are mimicking the master?
Yes, absolutely.
The slave masters.
Absolutely. That's the brilliance of colonization, to convince you to think that this unnatural behavior is who you are, that it's intrinsic, that there's some benefit from doing this. So Black people think, oh, I'm not in prison today because I got whooped.
What? Okay, so tell me why spanking is wrong. And remember that a lot of people are going to hear that and go, I got spanked and I turned out fine.
And I always say, think about how much better you could have been.
How much better could you have been? You'll never know who you would be if you hadn't gotten spanked.
Yes, exactly. We'd have never known.
More self-esteem,
more self-esteem, more intellectual capacity. You would have grown up to, if you really turned out fine, you would have grown up to look at that violence and say, this didn't feel good. You would have been able to tell the truth about it, that it didn't feel like love. I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel protected. I felt fear. But that you grew up to normalize it and invert that kind of domestic violence as something that was healthy and loving is a symptom, a sign that you actually didn't turn out fine.
Domestic violence?
It is. It's absolutely
Parents
domestic
spanking
violence.
Children is domestic violence.
Absolutely. It's not love.
I mean, if a man treated his wife the way that we think it's okay to treat our children, that would unquestionably be domestic violence.
Yeah.
But when you say, like, wow, even as much as your work as I've read, you calling domestic violence feels like, wow, really? But, I mean, yeah.
It's contrary to everything we've been taught about corporal punishment. Hitting children is the only form of domestic violence that we call love and for your own good. Think about it this way. If I hit you or you hit me in this moment, somebody's going to jail.
Sure.
Felony offense. If we walk down the street and smack a dog, we're going to get in trouble for that. But hitting children, this is the only group where it is codified in law. In every state, there is a law that tells you how you can appropriately hit a child. In 18 states, it is still legal to hit children with wooden boards in public schools. It's mostly in the South. Every state except New Jersey and Iowa allows hitting children in private and charter schools.
What is the impact on the kids?
Oh boy. So it starts very early. A lot of people start hitting popping their kids, plucking them, things like that, when they're around 2 years old. And what happens is you're wiring the brain and turning the brain in the wrong direction. So people think that, if I hit my child and I don't leave a mark on them, there's no damage. They're fine. But there are things that happen underneath the flesh that you can't see. The body is wired to go into fight or flight mode when there's a threat to their survival. So you don't see your child's adrenal glands, which sit on the kidneys, bursting off cortisol, which says to the body, prepare to either run, fight back, or freeze. That's what you do. It's non-negotiable. And what happens is over time, it changes the way a child's brain grows. The actual architecture of the brain gets altered. Their wiring, this will all affect cognition, learning, emotional regulation. It causes wear and tear on the immune system. So all of these things may not show up until after puberty or later on in life when you're having that heart attack. So you have this accumulation of toxic stress in your body. And so people often say, there's a difference between spanking a child and abusing a child. That's not true. That's not how the brain works. A child's brain cannot tell the difference between physical punishment that doesn't leave a mark, abuse that leaves marks, or sexual abuse. All three are toxic stress events. All three trigger the exact same neurochemical responses in a child's body that produces the same outcomes.
What is the impact on parents?
Well, the parents are actually hitting because they're dysregulated, because their nervous systems have been wired by that kind of because they experienced it. Yeah. And so when you're hitting a child, you're actually going through the same sort of fight or flight response. You're seeing your child as some kind of threat. It's not about teaching. People say, I hit my child to teach them. That's not how the brain works. A child cannot take in new information when they're in survival mode, because all that oxygenated blood goes to the muscles to do all that fight or flight mode work that I was talking about. They're not hearing you. They're not processing information. They're trying to survive the moment. And the parent who's doing the violence is actually going through the same kind of response system.
What do you say to folks who would say, the world is tough for Black children. There's always a risk of ending up in prison, blah, blah, blah. We need to be tough to prepare them for the tough world.
It's counterintuitive. It's actually setting them up for all of those systemic traps. If whipping Black children was so successful at keeping Black people out of prisons, then why do we keep having conversations about mass incarceration and police brutality? It doesn't save us from anything.
It's not the kids who don't get spanked who go to prison.
It's the ones who are.
It's kids who are coming up in a culture of violence who then replicate the violence and end up maybe in prison.
Absolutely. And all the we have about a half century's worth of scientific evidence that shows, this is from psychologists, this is folks who study family violence, juvenile justice. We've got brain scans now, people who are doing MRI studies of kids who are incarcerated and such, and they're seeing these brain changes in areas of the brain. So, the prefrontal cortex area, which is the area of your brain that you need for making good decisions, for emotional regulation, for communication and problem solving. All those areas are compromised and set the foundation for deviant behavior and violent behavior. And so if you go to any prison, if you go to any juvenile justice, facility, and you survey all of those kids or adults, I guarantee you nearly 100% of them will tell you they were beaten as kids.
But we don't, this is part of your big message, we don't need to be tough on our kids at home to prepare them for the tough, racist, white supremacist world. We should be nurturing them, especially our boys, because they won't get that. We should be nurturing them because they don't get that outside of the home, rather than be tough on them because they don't get that outside.
As you're doing exact opposite of the world. I mean, the world is going to show them that, they hate them, that the world is a mean place. Your home should be a sanctuary. Your home should be a safe place, not a place where your child has to be hyper vigilant and looking around and anticipating violence. So we got to do the exact opposite. Our early civil rights leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois was saying this to parents in the early part of the 20th century, that the home needs to be a safe space. So not using a negative to try to prevent a future negative.
I mean, some folks seem to think like you in this are proposing a sort of what white kids get, right? And we are like, we gotta be tough on the kids. They should respect their parents. They should know their place. And, some of the things you're talking about, I could hear some people saying like, it sounds real white. And you're like,
no, actually, beating a black child is the whitest thing you can do to destroy them intellectually.
Say it again.
Beating a black child is the whitest thing that you can do to destroy them psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, and physiologically. So what I talk about in my book, Spare the Kids, is I go back 2,000 years of history, back to antiquity in Europe, where corporal punishment, this ritualistic violence against children, was born. And,
in Europe.
And there are white guys who wrote books about this. So, when black women say this kind of stuff, nobody believes us. But I got the bibliography. So a bunch of white dudes wrote this before I was even born. And they've tracked all of this violence against children in Europe. Europeans never respected their own kids. They were absolutely brutal and barbaric with their own kids. It's all there. They didn't even recognize that children were biologically distinct until around, the 17th, century. They needed like a whole age of enlightenment to bring them into that awareness. You see it in their art.
Had children working.
They had children working. Children were enslaved in Europe. They were, you had this sort of religious ideology about kids being little demons. Yeah, and that wasn't part of many indigenous cultures thinking about children, including pre-colonial West Africans. So
what was it in pre-colonial West Africa?
So in pre-colonial West African cultures, there were, children were regarded as having led deeply spiritual lives before they got here. They chose their parents. They were magical. They were mystical. They were not property. The Bang people, for example, would never put a baby on the floor because that was disrespectful to a god, because children were considered gods. You think about the naming practices like Babatunde, father has returned. Yedatunde, mother has returned. You would never hit a child because you could drive away their spirit guides. To hit a child was to diminish you as the adults. And so they were so the Middle Passage experience, colonization, indoctrination into Christianity changed our language about children, our ideologies about children. And so in the enslavement process, we ended up internalizing some very Eurocentric ideas about children.
Do you see data about enslaved people spanking their children?
So we have oral histories.
Yeah.
So if you read a lot of books, like I'm thinking about Wilma King's Stolen Childhood, and there's a few other books that have looked at the experiences of people who grew up enslaved, and they talk about being beaten by white people, but they also talk about being beaten by their own parents and grandparents and other blacks. And the thinking was, look, if I beat you, this is going to be less damaging than massa. And that follows through the Jim Crow period where, black people were lynched, including black children. Like my next book is about the lynching of black children. And there was this idea that, well, if I beat you, you're going to be alive at the end of the day. Whereas if the Klan gets their hands on you, you're dead. And so we flash forward to this century, and you have black people, saying, look, if I don't beat my child, then the police will kill them. But then I traffic in data. I respect the fear. I get it. It's valid. But let me show you the data. So I looked at data for police shootings from between, I think it was 2013 to 2018. The Washington Post has this database called Fatal Force, which emerged during the Black Lives Matter era. So I disaggregated the number of black children who were killed by cops during that 5-year period. And the numbers were somewhere between 40 and 45 black children were killed by cops for different reasons. But then I looked at the annual child maltreatment fatalities data, so the number of black children who were killed by their own parents. So you got about 40 to 45 in that 5-year period who were killed by cops. And the number of black children who were killed by their own parents during that same time period was around 2,400. 2,400 Both are, bad public health issues, but the reality is that Black children are more at risk of being seriously injured or killed by their own parents than the cops. And so many of those kids who ended up in that 2,400 category were killed by parents who said, I was doing this so they didn't end up in that other category of kids who are killed by cops.
Is there a class difference in who is doing this?
No. There's not.
You see this
across.
There's really no Black upper class. So we see this in the Black working class and the Black middle class.
My adoptive parents were suburban, middle class, religious people. When you look at child trends, which is, they do all of this data surveying cultural attitudes about corporal punishment, and we see it track across educational backgrounds and across class. And a lot of people make this mistake in thinking that, white people don't beat their kids. It's not true. White people are less public about it. But in terms of the data, Black people don't hold a statistical monopoly over beating kids. White people tend to not live in neighborhoods where there's hyper surveillance by law enforcement and child protective services. They don't have to navigate systems where they could be caught. But it's crossing class, geography, race, ethnicity, educational background.
So are you saying that white people are doing the ritualistic, you did wrong, I'm going to spank you, hit you, pinch you, whatever thing that we're doing?
Absolutely.
At the same rates?
At similar rates. I mean, if you look at proportionally, in terms of raw numbers, more white children are abused every year. More white children die. More white children are actually paddled in schools in terms of raw numbers.
Really?
Now, in terms of proportions, because our numbers are different, we have disproportionately higher rates of abuse and higher rates of fatalities than whites.
And all spanking is abuse.
All hitting is abuse. All of it is abuse.
Hard. That's going to be hard for a lot of people to accept.
Because when you look at it in terms of what it does on a biochemical level, if I tell you that, okay, let me switch it. For example, I was in New Orleans and doing a community conversation about corporal punishment in a church, and there was a Black mother who was not feeling what I was saying. She was like, I don't agree with you. I spank my son on the butt and I don't leave marks. That's not abuse. So I asked her to come to the front and I showed her, I had the big screen up and I showed her an anatomical view of the backside, posterior view. And I said, Mama, what's underneath this? And she said, well, it's an ass. And so everybody started laughing. I said, of course, but what's underneath it? She couldn't answer the question. I turned to the audience. I said, what's under this? Reverend, what's under this? You're blessed with the gift of sight. Tell us what's underneath the buttocks, right? Couldn't do it. So I switched the view, this time with the skin dissected back. And I said, look what we've got here. We've got nerves, blood vessels connected to the spine, to the brain. I said, pay attention to the iliac artery. I said, that's close to the genitals, near the rectum, the scrotum, all of that, right? And I said, when you spank your son there's instant blood flow, and some of that blood flows off to his genitals. The only other time we see that kind of genital blood flow is during sexual arousal. There was an audible gasp.
So what are you saying?
So it's abuse. It's sexualized violence. That's what I'm saying. And people were deeply offended by it. And I said, I know this makes you uncomfortable, but this is how the body works. This may not be your intent to cause that kind of, because a child is so focused on the pain that they don't even realize that this other process is being triggered in their genitals. And so, there are some people who looked at that and said, I'm never doing that again because that's abusive. That's not healthy.
Yeah.
It could have, potential consequences for his sex life later on.
Yeah.
And they're like, I'm abandoning that. But others look at that and they just shake their heads because they don't want to look back on their own childhoods and think, oh my God, my parents who loved me and I loved my parents did this harmful thing. Oh, I got just abused, beaten with belts, extension cords, all of that. This is why I do this work by my adoptive mother.
A lot?
A lot.
Till what age?
Got the scars on my face to
this day. You got hit in your face?
Oh, yeah.
Till what age?
Till I ran away at age 12.
Oh, you ran.
I was like, I cannot do this slavery, 12 years of slave reenactment in the living room. I'm done. Can't do it.
I got hit a lot. My father would use his hand on my butt. That was never, not any other places. Mm-hmm. My mom might have pinched. I don't remember. Now that you are looping pinching and everything, she may have. I don't specifically remember that. But it was extremely painful. It was traumatizing because this is from age 3 to 9 or 10, probably not 10, but maybe definitely 8 or 9. So he's at least twice my size. So it was traumatizing. He was definitely hitting as hard as he could. So it was like a whole wind up thing. Mm-hmm. And the thing is that looking back now, well, there's two things. Looking back now, I was not able to regulate the behavior that he was trying to correct. So the violence wasn't doing anything. It was, I was moody, and I don't know how to biologically quantify that, but like, I wasn't trying to be bad, but like, don't do that. Don't. And like, I don't think that I was not able to change. So the violence wasn't making me change because there was like, I don't have this control. I don't have control over this behavior that you were trying to regulate. So the other thing too is that my mother wouldn't touch me in that way. So it was when your father gets home, mm-hmm. he'll do it. Mm-hmm. So then it might be a 1 to 6 hour wait.
Had to do all that waiting
of stress mm-hmm. of like, Dad's gonna come home and beat the shit out of me. Yeah. And then he would come home and she would tell, he said he did blah, 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 blah. And he'd be furious and come in and beat you up. And I'm like crying. There was not really discussion. It was just like pound and I leave. And yeah, when my wife was like, we're not going to do that, I still needed education. It was like, okay, she's adamant, so I got to find the education to understand why we're not doing it. Because I'm like, this is how you parent. I hadn't yet realized like the beatings didn't do anything because this is how I was emotionally. I couldn't like. I didn't.
So I'm thinking about what you said, something very powerful when you were, reconnecting with a little boy and saying, I couldn't regulate this. So what you're talking about is developmental psychology. You're talking about neuroscience. What I tell parents is that in the first 1,000 days, a child's 85% of a child's brain develops. That's the first 3 years of life. Children come into the world, they're all sensory. They have no logic. They have no narrative. They have no critical thinking. They know nothing about patriarchy. They know nothing about racism. They know nothing about history. The only history they know is the history of their brain, which is indelibly shaped by their primary caretaker in those first experiences. The brain's job is to let the body know that it's safe. Right. And so their sensory receptors are their eyes, their nose, their ears, their mouth, the skin. And so the interactions with the parents tell that child's brain how to grow, how to be wired. So the child is thinking, am I fed? Are these people responding to me when I'm crying? Am I safe? Can I develop a healthy attachment with these people? Now, if you have toxic parents who are yelling, hitting, all of that stuff, evolution says you still have to attach to these people. A child is still going to attach to an abusive parent, and the brain is going to do make whatever adaptations it needs to make to optimize that child's survival. That's why so many people grow up and they say, oh, that was love, because this is happening in the early formative years of the brain. So hitting and love kind of fuse together in that prefrontal cortex area of the brain and internalize it as love, as protection. And that's why people are so defensive about, why I got a hit because of these early messages. And it impacts the way you think about yourself in the world, your relationships. And also, when you're talking about your mother's role, right? She may not have hit you, but she was complicit in the betrayal and in the violence. So I get into a lot of trouble, particularly with feminist scholars over this. They like to look at male violence and men's attitudes about women and say it's all patriarchy. And I'm not dismissing patriarchy. I'm not dismissing structural racism. But if you really want to understand how some men relate to women in terms of their attitudes and behaviors, you have to go back to their earliest childhood experiences with their mothers. And when we look at the data, particularly in Black communities on child abuse, the data tells us that the majority of the abuse and the fatalities are perpetuated by women. And so if you want to figure out why a man is a misogynist, you've got to go back to those early childhood experiences. And people don't want to have that conversation because then we have to talk about maternal violence and women's complicity in creating the very men who hate us.
So, yeah, you are making the point that when mom beats her son, that leads to him growing up to beat his wife or girlfriend.
Yes. She sets the template. That is his first, intimate relationship with a female.
Yeah.
And so you see it all the time, these women who
he loves her. The young child loves her in a romantic way.
Well, I don't know if it's romantic. I don't know much
of her as like a girlfriend almost. He has that sort of.
I've never been a boy, so so I don't know. Okay. But it's that first relationship with a female, and he's setting the tone. And what happens is he's not going to make his mother pay for all that pent up aggression and rage. He projects it, elsewhere. Think about our rap artists. I think about Tupac. Although you were, a dope fiend mama, you always were a black queen. You grabbed me and put a whoop into my backside, right? And this is the celebration of a black mother can be a crackhead, beat the crap out of you, and still be a god and worshipped. But then, they redirect all of that pent up rage and aggression toward other women in our communities.
With us, also, it's, as in my story, it's more than just the actual violence. There's also the threat. Mm-hmm. I will whoop you, right? Like somebody who's beaten you, they might do it again. So now if I am acting on the potential of that threat. So that, and when we are comfortable saying, I brought you in this world and I can take you out. Obviously spare the rod, spoil the child.
Which isn't even in the Bible.
Right.
It's not even in the Bible.
Wow.
That sentence is not there.
That's amazing that we've heard so many times the Bible says, and it's actually not there.
No.
So many people have heard, I'll whoop you till the white meat and other sorts.
Bernie Mac.
Right? So, just the talk.
Internalized racism.
The culture of threatening children with violence is part of this whole thing.
Yeah. Tyler Perry, in all of his movies, Medea is always beating beats a foster kid on screen, is always threatening them, talking down to them. There's always that threat of violence. So black children are always between a rock and a hard place. So you're in a world where, I think a few years ago, we heard adults debating whether unarmed children deserve to die, whether it was Trayvon Martin, whether it was Tamir Rice. They go into the school systems, and we know what those outcomes are like. We see the disproportionate rate of, school punishments and through suspensions and expulsions and such in those spaces. Black children live in a world where nobody is expressing any sort of kindness toward them, any sort of positive measurements about them. In every study you see, they're always failing at something. That's what this big ecosystem is telling them. And then they come into their own communities, and it's just such toxic language. These kids today, we see it on social media where people pick up cameras and they're shaming these kids, cutting off their eyebrows, giving them old man haircuts, beating them on screen, laughing about it, and then, blaming them for all the systemic social problems that we have in our schools. And then we wonder why the adolescent suicide rates are off the charts, and that people have such cognitive dissonance. Like, we don't know why an 8-year-old is committing suicide, because everywhere everywhere they turn, there's verbal and physical violence, or the threat of all of these different threats against their life that puts them in survival mode and has their bodies, they're walking around full of all kinds of toxic stress.
And we see how prevalent this is in the comedy, right? And so much of our comedy is joking about, I got whooped with a bigger switch than you. I got beat
with the whole tree.
Yes, we laugh about this from the barbershop to the comedy stage, and we see it in. I mean, like, what do you think about the way that we keep talking about it in our culture?
Yeah, so the comedy is a way to deal with the pain, to not have to deal with the truth of it. So I produced this little video recently on maternal drag. So, which I blame Tyler Perry for. So you have all of these young men on Instagram, on TikTok, Facebook, and other social platforms who dress up like their mothers. They put on bonnets and, house coats, and they reenact their mother. So they do these camera cuts. So one scene, they're the mother, and then they're the boy. And the mothers are very ugly. They just look terrible. And for me, I look at that and say, that's what they remember as boys. Their mom's faces, that scowling, the roughness in the voices, the threatening, and there's just the constant beating. It's a whole genre of this. And people laugh at it, and they get on the comment threads and they all testify. It becomes this way to say, yep, this is what I got. We need more parenting like this. But these men, sometimes they're called misogynists for doing this. And I'm like, that's not misogyny. They're reenacting their trauma. They're looking for enlightened witnesses to say, look at what I went through. This is the only therapeutic way or outlet that I have to testify about what I experienced, at the hands of my mother. And so we just laugh at it, and the laughing helps to normalize it. And that's why we have the statistical outcomes that we have, because people aren't stopping and having serious conversations and calling this what it is, which is violence. We would never see this kind of content showing men, beating women in this way and reenacting it. But with children, it's fine.
It seems a way that partly what we're doing is bragging about how tough we are and how much we can survive, and I can survive the white man, and I survived my mother's home. And it's like, really? You survived the beatings? That's a stripe for you?
Yeah. I was recently in a PBS documentary done by Byron Hurt called Hazing. And in his documentary, I talked about
fraternities and sororities.
Yes. So the branding, the paddling, all of that stuff. And it was that sort of thing.
That's related to all of this.
Yep, all of it. All of it. So it's a sort of this transgenerational inheritance from slavery, right? So that, to be a strong Black man, to be a strong Black woman, to be successful, your body had to be processed through some kind of violence and pain. It's totally the slave master's logic that the only way to make these people obedient, good folks, successful is to process them through violence. It's the only way. It's such internalized. Beating kids is such internalized racism.
No, when you go into a fraternity or sorority, you are probably 18 or 19. Mm-hmm. You are a child.
Yep.
And I went to a college where there was Black and white fraternities and sororities. As far as I know, white fraternities and sororities require no violence to get in. There might be a lot of alcohol consumption.
Yeah, you just have to drink a whole keg of something.
But both, as far as I know, fraternities, Black fraternities and Black sororities,
you have to get beat.
Right? There is some moment of violence in the hazing or introductory process. Yeah. And that is part of all this and a hand down from slavery.
Yep. And then if you say, and some people will say, these kids today are soft because they don't want to be beaten. They don't want to have scars on their flesh. Right? They don't want to be subjected to violence. They want someone to talk to them, to treat them with dignity and respect. That's soft. And there's this idea that if you handle your kids with compassion and empathy and care, then you're being white. You're putting them at risk for the world, that's brutal. They're not going to be prepared to be out there fighting when it's really all these people who are beating their kids that are creating a world that's so harsh and lacking empathy and such.
Where else do we see the ritualized beating of Black children? Because you just pointed out to me, like, hazing is a part of this family tree, which I'd never put that together. Where else so it's in the home, it's in the colleges, like, I mean, obviously it's in the schools.
Yeah.
It's not really in the schools anymore today, is it?
No, it absolutely is.
Really?
There are 18 states in this country, primarily in the South, where it is still legal to hit children with wooden boards.
But are they doing it?
They are absolutely doing it. So the data shows us that around 250,000 kids each year are being paddled by school teachers and administrators. Some school districts have what's called immunity clauses, so that if you injure a child while in the course of hitting them, you can't be prosecuted. Now, schools, in terms of the teachers and principals and administrators, are supposed to be mandated reporters. These people are required to report any kind of abuse if a child comes in and the parent has scarred them. But you put paddles in these teachers' hands. Some school districts have been in recent times trying to bring it back, particularly after COVID, because kids lost 2 years of socialization. We saw a lot of violence coming back into the schools because God knows what was happening to those kids on lockdown. And so they think the solution is to beat the kids. In some places, particularly like, say, Mississippi, the parents sign what's called opt-in forms. So if your kid acts out, you have 3 choices. You can come get the kid. The parents are like, I'm at work, I can't be doing that. The kid can get an in-school suspension, or they can be paddled. So they're taken, bent over a desk, and somebody is winding up and hitting them with a board.
Up to what age?
It's K-12.
K through 12?
K through 12.
Well,
and get this, if, let's say, because this would have been me, if, let's say I'm in the 10th grade and some teacher's trying to beat me with I'm fighting
we're
back.
We're about to fight. Because 10th grade, you might be the same size as a teacher.
Yes.
Oh, we're fighting.
Yes.
No,
and then
you're not
those
gonna hit
kids
me.
get arrested.
Sure.
Now they've got a felony and they're out of the school system. And now they've got to go to some alternative situation. And so it's just not a positive situation at all.
Is there anywhere else that we see the accepted and normalized, ritualized beating of Black children?
So schools, churches, we see it in churches. People do it in church. This is whole evangelical movement. And this is black and white. There's actually a film about the Dugars on, I think is maybe Amazon, which is part of that sort of religious culture where the preachers get up there and they demonstrate how you're supposed to, beat your kids, that God wants you to do this. And so they give whole tutorials on, raising kids the right way. Also, there's greater numbers of people who are homeschooling their kids to kind of skirt attention from the authorities who would be, reporting them for abuse. So we see it in church spaces. It's infused in, the preaching. We see it in the digital space. So like you can go on like YouTube, World Star Hip Hop, and you can see videos. Just put in "whoop a child" or just "whoopings" or something, and you see rap videos where people are like "whoop your kids." Yeah. This is how you whoop a child. There's just different themes. My daughter got whooped today because she was pretending to be older. Got a bad report card. Whoop your child. It permeates the culture.
What happens in a home where they say, we're not beating, we're not touching, we're going to talk to you till we're blue in the face? I mean, a lot of people are like, what other way is there to discipline children? Like, are you kidding? Like, either it's corporal punishment or no discipline whatsoever?
Yeah. That's the misunderstanding that people think, that if you don't beat your kids, your children are not getting disciplined.
Right.
So discipline means to teach, which requires modeling behavior. Those parents understand child development, so they're actually educating themselves so that they don't have unreasonable expectations for what a 2-year-old can do. So like recently this mom was like, well, what do I do when I have a 2-year-old that won't listen and she's stubborn? And I'm like, first of all, she's 2. They're a part of her brain that can't process what you're saying. Auditory processing doesn't really complete until age 14. It's a slow process. So you're having unreasonable expectations for what her brain and her body and nervous system can actually do. So those parents who are practicing things like gentle parenting, conscious parenting, painless parenting are educating themselves. And they're also doing work on themselves. So they have to unpack why they're triggered by their child's behavior, why they're angry, and getting
Because
something.
children are very frustrating.
Yes. Because they don't have the language to try to say to you, yo, I'm feeling this today. Right? I'm a little melancholy mom, right? 3-year-old can't do, they just do it through their behaviors, or they're hungry, they're tired, right? They need your attention and connection.
I mean, a lot, when you talk about, I want to hear more about pain-free, gentle, and what was the other word used?
Conscious parenting.
Conscious parenting. And I think a lot of it comes down to patience, right? Because we want the child to do whatever it is we want them to do within the time frame that we want them to do it. And sometimes when you have a child in the moment, you have to throw out the clock and say, I may have to say this 4, 5, 6 times or 10 times. Yeah. And if that means we're late to the thing, that it is what it is. But like, I have to exercise patience because you don't understand things in the same time frame that I understand.
But a lot of these parents can't give to their children what wasn't given to them. So if you were raised in the house where there was impatience, where there was no empathy, where there was a lot of yelling and hitting because you were doing developmentally normal things, then here you are as a parent and your child does that exact developmentally normal thing that you did as a kid, and you remember, oh, I got beat, I got yelled at for this, then the instinct is to do the exact same thing. So you're really responding to some stuff from your own past when you're projecting that back onto your kids.
Because it's very painful to be critical of your parents and your childhood, right? Most people don't say there was something wrong in some people do, but most people would say my childhood was great because they think, right, I'm great, right? So then they're not going to say, well, my parents hit and I didn't like that, so I'm not going to do that. That's what happens. That's what you do.
That's because people are socialized to do that. They're socialized to lie about their childhood. They're socialized to commit treason against the child who always knew better, to gaslight the child, to say, to call it love instead of fear, love instead of betrayal, love instead of pain, love instead of psychological damage, right? So, people have to recover the truths of their autobiographical histories, tell the truth about it to say, yeah, that wasn't cool. And multiple things can be true. You can still love your parents. You can still honor them. But to say, you know what? They did some things that I didn't like.
You are not necessarily in touch with everything that's going on within you, right? There are people walking around who were molested or raped or whatever, as children, as adults, whatever. And do they seem fine in a given moment? Sure. Might they say, I'm fine or I'm mostly fine? Yeah. Are you fully aware of how the trauma continues to sit in you? No. And affect, no. And like you might say, I mean, on one level, I can say, yeah, my father beat me up a lot, and yet I feel like I am fine. But I don't interact with the trauma that was, right? So I don't even know how that's affected me.
Again, and I go back to the first 1,000 days of life. So I'm an adoptee, and I was separated from my adoptive mother, my biological mother, when I was an infant. I have no memory of this. I have no narrative around it. I can't tell you about that day, but being separated from her was a trauma that lives in my body to this day, because being separated from your mom is unnatural. And so it's in my body, and it has shaped my brain, shaped my nervous system, my sense of self-concept, in ways that I've been able to wrap language around, in ways that I'm not fully aware. There are certain behaviors, certain things that I've repeated over the years that is deeply connected to that. And it's the same thing when you have a parent who beats you. who threatens you, who makes you feel fear, and you live in an ecosystem that tells you that's love everywhere you turn, whether it's church, whether it's music, whether it's the jokes, all the things that we're talking about, that is socializing you to normalize it and call it love instead of what it was, which was trauma and violence. And it's going to live in your body. So as adults, we can make a theoretical distinction between abuse and corporal punishment. Children can't. Our brains will tell us, have us thinking that these narratives that other people socialized us to believe. But the body is like, no, girl, this is living in you. It's still in your body. It's unhealthy, and it's still impacting how you navigate the world, how you think about yourself.
So when you talk about forcibly separated from my biological mother at a very, very early age, abused in your adoptive home, ran away at a very young age, chose to not have children, right?
No, I just don't have any right now.
Okay.
Yeah. I love kids. So maybe there's still a window.
Okay. Well, but don't have children yet?
Not yet.
So is this work coming out of your personal experience as sort of like a mission of like, I have to tell the world, don't give your children the childhood that I had?
Yes, absolutely. Every morning I wake up and I look in the mirror and I have to see these extension cord marks on my face.
Where?
On this side of my face. So there's a lot of reasons why I wear hats. So I've got these marks going from here all the way down my cheek and on other parts of my body. I look at a fractured wrist, right? I look at those, the marks are there. And so for me, I look at that stuff and I say, this is my fleshy braille, right? That narrates the story of pain, the truth about what I endured. It is about survival, but it's also a reminder. And and I look at all that and I say, I don't want any other kids to experience what I experienced. Now, some people will say, well, that was abuse. She left scars in you. I don't want any kid to be hit. It's not love. It doesn't make children feel safe.
Any hit is abuse.
Any hit. Doesn't matter.
What about a pinch?
It's abuse. Because again, as I told you, it triggers the exact same neurochemical.
We'd be like, well, a whooping is different than a spanking. It's different than a beating.
It's not.
Like, what are we talking about?
The law says that, yeah, there are legal definitions, but that's not what the body says. A child's, let's go back to the adrenal glands sitting on the kidneys, right? When you're about to pop, hit, pinch, you're a bigger person, right? The adrenal glands don't sit there and say, wait, that's just a pinch. Wait, she doesn't have a switch in her hand. Oh, that's just a hand. Oh, her intent is to teach me. Oh, she wants to keep me protected. That's not what the adrenal glands do. The adrenal glands burst off the cortisol and say, fight or flight mode. Protect yourself. This is danger. Survive.
One of the formative, I don't know if it's formative, one of the most memorable moments of my childhood, I'm sitting there in the living room with my mom, my sister, watching Good Times. And Penny,
I remember that.
Janet Jackson, who was about 10. I was about 10. So we're the same age, same height. Came in. It was a very special episode about beating. They were not, as a show, they were not in favor of beating, right? Because Penny pulls down the back of her shirt.
Oh, no, you forget. James actually beats one of Michael's angry friends on the show. With a belt.
In that episode?
Not in that episode. It was a different episode. And James was always the angry father coming in, tugging at his belt at JJ, who's like grown, basically. Yeah. So the father was a very toxic, volatile presence.
Well, when Penny pulls down the back of her shirt, and there's a very clear iron mark. And so she got burned with an iron on her back. And that might have been a horror movie to me. I was like, oh, people do that, Mom. And she's like, some people do that. And she didn't say it was wrong. But I felt like in that moment, the show was saying that was wrong.
Yeah.
But you're like, they were giving us a mixed message because in other instances, the dad was clearly...
Yep. And even the Cosbys. I mean, Bill Cosby, even though they were upper middle class or wealthy, when he tells Theo, I brought you in this world.
I take you out.
Take you out.
I'm like, I was like, no, you can't. Like, we know you go to jail for murdering your kid.
Yeah. Even Obama did it. So recall during his first presidency, he delivered the keynote address at the 100th anniversary of the NAACP meeting. It was here in New York. And he got up there and he wagged his finger at black people like he always did. You got to read to your kids. You got to put them to bed at a decent hour, as if we don't do those sorts of things. And then he says, we got to go back to the time when if someone saw you acting out in the neighborhood, it wasn't your child, but they could grab you up and whoop you. And then you went back home and your parents beat you as well. And then the crowd is like, yay. So here's this biracial man who grew up in between Hawaii and Indonesia, raised by his white grandparents. And, his wife said that they hit their oldest daughter once and never did it again because it didn't work. So to authenticate his blackness with that crowd, he played off of this old trope about the village giving you a communal beating and basically said we need to go back to that time, despite the fact that we're still dealing with structural inequalities, state violence, all of these, issues that we've been dealing with for generations. And he said that.
And where we are, the crowd completely agrees.
Yep.
And there's not it's not half the crowd like, whoa, wait, no, the crowd is like, yes, beat the children.
Exactly.
That's horrifying.
Yep. And even when we think about the infamous Baltimore mom, LaToya Graham, down in Baltimore, I'd written this piece for the Washington Post. The headline was, "Why is America celebrating the beating of a black child?" And I got so much backlash from both black people and white people on that. And I thought, well, isn't this interesting? Black and white people's philosophies align around beating kids.
And what was the argument coming back at you?
So I was arguing that she's not a hero for this.
What was the argument coming back at you?
That she was a hero. A lot of it was no argument at all. They were just cursing at me and telling me to shut up. You don't have any kids. So then my reproductive life becomes part of the discussion as if that has any relevance whatsoever.
Yeah.
So these people who were angry with me most people who agree with beating kids, they actually demonstrate what the science says about the damage it does to critical thinking and to emotional regulation. Because a lot of these people just yell and curse, and they're just angry. They go from 0 to 100. And I'm looking at them like, yeah, prefrontal cortex is jacked. Central nervous system is just gone haywire. So they just demonstrate exactly what all the science says about why you shouldn't hit kids.
And they're very defensive about, like, it's right. It's the right thing to do.
Well, also because this is the only power that a lot of these people have in their lives. I just have the power to beat a child. That's why as kids get older and bigger, the beatings decrease. Because now you risk the possibility of that child jacking you up.
You got it right. You got to think about that. If you are making a regular habit of beating a 6, 7, 8-year-old, what are you supposed to do when the person turns 14, 15 and they're bigger than you?
Yeah.
And like, so we're going to have a fight now? Like a fair fight? Like, no, that's ridiculous. But
it's about power and control. And a lot of these people are just paying it forward. I got beat. Now it's my turn to do it to you.
We should not have fear in the parental-child relationship.
No. Well, a lot of people will say, I need my child to fear me, and I'm not my child's friend. And I'm like, you absolutely should be friends with your child. That's part of making your home a safe place.
Well, they're saying we're going to be on different levels, right? A friend is a peer, is an equal, right? That's
a very limited definition of friendship.
But I mean,
think about friendship.
But with your mom or your dad, right? Like there's a different level. Like you don't just say anything to your mom, right? There's certain language you wouldn't say, right? You're supposed to be somewhat deferential, whereas when you're with your friends, I say whatever I want and we're equal, right? Is that?
But that's one definition of friendship. So I think about friendship as a place of trust, a place of good communication, empathy, openness, honesty, right? So those basic elements, right? And you're a safe person that I can come to talk about what's going on in my life. Maybe I'm afraid of something. Maybe something has happened. And so a lot of these parents are like, I'm not my child's friend. I'm not here to be your little friend, right? It's like they're having a power trip. Like, you're going to respect me. I'm the dominant one. It's just this very rigid hierarchical thing. You're going to listen to me. You're not going to talk back. You're not going to challenge me. So I'm not saying, friendship in a peer-to-peer context. Like, I'm friends with people who are in their 80s. I'm friends with, folks who are teenagers, adolescents.
But the other part of it is that many parents think the child should fear them, and that will steer them right.
Yeah. You can't learn anything when you're afraid. You can't have true trust and honesty when there's fear. Again, that's not how the brain works. If I fear you, so for example, if I needed help solving for X, right? And I'm doing algebra. And
put a gun to your head, you're not going to be able to do that equation.
Right. And I want to come to my parent and to get some help or advice. Maybe it's not algebra, it's something else. And I'm afraid of you. I'm not coming to you for help. I'm going somewhere else, right? Because I can't take in new information. I can't receive things from you if I'm afraid of you.
Is it partly the relationship that Christianity tells us to have with God, where we should be afraid of God because we don't do the right thing, we go to hell?
Yeah, and here's the thing. And a lot of Black people get mad at me for stating these historical facts. But when we look at pre-colonialized West African cultures, we weren't Christians. Those people who ended up, who were forced onto those ships were not Christians. They were either Muslims or they were engaged in other indigenous practices. They were worshiping Orishas, female gods. Think about that, right? And so we've been socialized to think of Africa as the dark continent with all this hoodoo and voodoo and those sorts of things. And so, we did not learn Christianity from the Nubians. We didn't learn it from, the Africans on the, eastern part of the continent. We learned it within the slave tradition. We learned a bastardized version of Christianity, with all of its, most toxic elements distorted and taken, out of context. I always tell people that you can't be a worshiper of Jesus Christ and beat kids, because Jesus never hit a child. He would never hit a child. He snuggled with them. He coddled them. He said we had to be gentle with them and kind to them, that to enter his Father's kingdom, you had to be more like a child. So you can't be a follower of Christ and be somebody who's misquoting a scripture that's not even in there. Spare the rod, spoil. It's not that sentence is not in the Bible.
Is there anything in the Bible about that?
Oh, there's all kinds of toxic things about the treatment of children in the Old Testament. Drowning babies, stoning them, sacrificing your kids.
But like that sentence, is it just a lie?
He that spareth the rod hateth his son, right? But again, you have to look at the Hebrew interpretation of rod. So rod is a walking stick. It's a shepherd's, the shepherd's rod had like this little hook at the top of it. Right. So if a sheep, wandered off or got stuck in some hilly place, you pull that sheep back into the fold, into safety. The only time a shepherd wielded it was to fight off predators. Right. He didn't beat a sheep. Sheep were valuable. They were used as sacrifices to God. So you couldn't bring a sheep to God and it was all blemished and bruised. And plus, a sheep will leave you. They'll be like, deuces, I'm not fit for abuse. It'll run away from you. The rod was also this kind of symbol that signified wisdom, direction, guidance. It was a place where you would come for safety. It wasn't about taking this thing and beating your kid with it. And so you have to look at the original translation of those verses in Proverbs. He that doesn't give his child wisdom, direction, and guidance sets them up for this life that's no good. It wasn't about beating kids at all. And I say to Black people, like, look, you can be Christians, but this is unnatural to our spiritual cosmos. The fact that we speak English and the fact that so many of us are Christians and beat our kids is a sign that we're colonized people. This isn't who we were.
I love that the way that you broke down spare the rod, spoil the child, because part of the problem is that we are dealing with a translation of a translation, right? And it may not look exactly the same in different versions, different countries, whatever, different languages. And we don't speak the language that it was translated from or the language it was translated from before that.
And here's another fact. It took us about a century for Africans in America to learn English. We didn't learn it overnight. It was a few generations. It was illegal for us to read and write. Mm-hmm. So we couldn't even read that King James Version Bible. It was illegal. So whatever we got, all of our interpretations, our original learning about, the Bible came within the context of slavery. Mm. This isn't who we are. We weren't Christians. And when we go back to those pre-colonized, West Africans and look at the ways that the spiritual ideas and concepts they had about kids, the language that they use, they would say children talk to the gods. That they believed that children were superior to adults. Don't give a child too much salt. There's this whole line of when I do community conversations, I show them, I take a pan-continental view from oral traditions to show people how we talked about kids. And we believe that they were reincarnated ancestors, right? So you wouldn't beat your reincarnated great-grandmother. You wouldn't do that. And so we have to look at the ways in which colonization, slavery, and indoctrination into Western Christianity changed our thinking. Mm. And now we spare the rod, spoil the child. That's just natural.
But that's not what the rod meant. Mm-mm. It wasn't a rod for beating.
Thy rod and thy staff comfort me. That don't sound like an ass whooping.
You are doing God's work, and I hear you keep saying, I upset Black people when I say this, but this is important perspective and data and knowledge. So please keep spreading your sermon.
Absolutely. And you know what? I do this because I love our people deliriously. Even though I don't have children, every time I'm walking down the street and I see a child, I say, look at that little God. People look at me like I'm crazy when I call children gods, but my blood reverse circulates when I see a child, because when I look at these children, they are redemption, they're hope, they're healing. They have this enormous genius potential within them to help us heal from so much. But our liberation as a people and for our communities depends on us safeguarding our children's brains and their nervous systems and handling them carefully.